So my name is Zubair Rahman and I'm currently a student of Cambridge O levels. So our today's topic of discussion is basically active transport. Also, here it is active transport, the opposite to the passive transport, which are the osmosis and the diffusion. In our previous two topics, we have discussed about both of the passive transports, about both of the diffusion and the osmosis. And in this, we are going to discuss the topic active transport, which is one of a very unique and a very interesting topic. So let's start by the basics of the active transport. That what is active transport? So both diffusion and osmosis are passive processes that use the internal kinetic energy of the cells for transportation. We have recently studied that all the cells have internal kinetic energy in them, and the diffusion and the osmosis are basically processes that do not use any of the external source of energy. They both rely on only the internal kinetic energy stored in them. But in the case of the active transport takes internal energy in the form of ATP, which is released by the respiration in the cells. ATP is basically a chemical, adenosine triphosphate. So if we talk about the definition of the active transport, so the definition of the active transport is that active transport is the movement of molecules from a region of low concentration to a region of high concentration up the concentration gradient using energy ATP. We can also say it as the movement of molecules from a region of low concentration to a region of high concentration against the concentration gradient. In this, low concentration to up concentration basically means the movement of any ion from an area where it is present in less amount to an area where it is present in high amount. It is basically the opposite to the diffusion. Alright, so these molecules move in and out of the cell through transport proteins. On the cell membranes, there are basically some, we can say, protein pumps are present. The transport proteins are present. So these molecules basically enters or leaves the cell through the transport proteins. The active transport can be better understood by the example of the water pump. That's how the water pump drives the water from the land where the water is low concentration, using the energy from the motor, using the energy from the battery from the external source. Alright, so this was basically the basics of the active transport. That the active transport is a process of the movement of substances from a region of low concentration to a region of high concentration against a concentration gradient, and using the energy ATP, and these molecules move in and out through transport proteins. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the examples of the active transport. So the first example is in the root hair cells. So in the root hair cells are basically the cells that are present on the roots, on the tip end of the roots, and these are basically specialized cells, and their function is absorption. Alright, so in the root hair cells, one example, the root hair cells have stored ions in them. The root hair cells have subvacuole in them, where the ions are stored. So as a result of this, there is high concentration of ions in the root hair cells as compared to the concentration of ions in the soil. And since the plant needs these ions to carry out their functions, like it needs the minerals potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. in large quantities, so by the process of active transport, these ions enter into the cell. So in this, we basically studied that the root hair cells, which basic function is the absorption of water and these ions, so in them these ions are already present, so there is high concentration of these ions in the root hair cells. So then by the process of active transport, these ions enter into the root hair cells through the soil. Well, so now I'm going to tell you about the structure of the root hair cell. So yeah, this is the structure which you can see on the screen. The root hair cells, it's basically a thin long structure with you can see the sap vacuole and the cell wall in the cell membrane, and these basically you can also see the soil and the water and the mineral, and you can see the direction of these minerals entering into the root hair cells. And these basically three cells attached to the root hair cell, these are basically root cortex cells. So this was basically the structure of the root hair cell. Alright, so after this, we're going to talk about the example of the active transport in the animals. So, in the example of the active transport in the animals, we're going to talk about the active transport small intestine. Well, so active transport also take place in the small intestine of the glucose. Glucose is a sugar. The last part of our small intestine is called ileum. It is the function of the ileum is basically absorption of the products of digestion. So the glucose, which is also a product of the digestion, is also present in the small intestine, and it is in less concentration in the small intestine. So by the process of active transport, the ileum basically absorbs this glucose by the process of active transport. So basically in this ileum there are thousands and millions of villi, tiny hair-like structures present, who basically by the process of active transport absorbs them, and their function is absorption, similar to the root hair cell. So alright, so I'm gonna show you the structure of the villi and how does they look like. Alright, so this is the basically the structure of the villi that you can see on the screen. So it is basically a very basic structure that I could find, and I shared it with you. Well, so this was all about our today's motive of the discussion. That today we discussed about the active transport and the example of the active transport in the root hair cells and in the animal cells. So if you liked the video, so you can like the video, and you can also subscribe to my channel. And thank you for today's video. Allah Hafiz.